the paper draws from a qualitative Families on Remand project, which was funded by the Oakdale Trust, so thank you very much. So it's with 61 loved ones who are supporting individuals who were or who had been on remand, so anyone who had experience of remand, and we kind of shed light on these pains of imprisonment for loved ones through this through the nature of how ambiguous loss is experienced by this group. So by its very nature, we argue that remand, those affected by remand are impacted by an ambiguous situation which is beyond their control. And in the paper, we argue that ambiguous loss may be present. We argue that both types of ambiguous loss can be experienced by these loved ones. So they may be physically absent, but psychologically present, or they might be psychologically absent, but physically present. And by viewing it through this lens, we get a better understanding of their experiences and also what future policies and practices need to address to try and reduce this type of ambiguous loss. So there were many overlapping issues that related to ambiguous loss that came out of our interviews and thematic analysis, but we have framed our paper around two overarching themes. So the first one is living in limbo and uncertainty, which is linked to the nature of ambiguous loss and the impact on individuals' mental health. And then the second theme is a more kind of proactive or reactive, which is reducing the ambiguity, which examines how people might take responses or how they might take actions to mitigate this ambiguous loss, including active roles to support those in prison, as well as those in prison entering guilty pleas to end this kind of indefinite time that they might be in prison. They get a release date. So the first one, the living in limbo. So those interviewed who were unprepared for remand, for those individuals, the loss attached to incarceration was sudden and particularly acute, and the unknown period that they would have to wait until they had answers or certainty caused a lot of anguish. So the first quote here is from one mum, Jackie. So she said, "You didn't know how long this nightmare would go on for. We didn't know if he'd be found guilty or what. It was just horrible waiting and not knowing for all of that time." And so for many living in limbo like this or waiting was made worse by court delays. So a partner, Jenny, spoke about that every time he had court, they were dropping the court date, they were changing the date, they were delaying it. And that relationship just changed the relationship. So they were constantly waiting, and they couldn't move on with their lives until they had this court date, because essentially they couldn't do anything. And court delays remain a systemic issue within our criminal justice system, of which we argue that the loved ones of remand prisoners feel the brunt of. Several clung to the hope that they would get a court date, that a court date wouldn't be delayed, that those in prison would be found not guilty, and that they would have this release date to work towards. And many said that their remand was made worse due to ongoing concerns for their loved one's safety in prison, based on what they had experienced, or the fact that any type of communication could be severed, very, very quickly, so easily disrupted. And this had a significant impact on the loved ones that we spoke to, their mental health. Because of this ongoing unknown related to it. So Bindi, one of the mums that we spoke to, she said that her heart's in her mouth 24 hours, that she's scared the whole time, that at night she's by herself, so high levels of fear, and that she just needs her life to come back to normal, that she was, it was really, really significantly impacting her. So moving on to the second theme, in comparison, other interviewees maintained their level of mental health despite what was happening to them, what was being put upon them, and kind of the associated and what was related to their loved ones' remand. And we suggest that potentially this is due to actions that were taken to reduce the ambiguity or feelings of loss, which is what I'll move on to next. So to counteract the erosion that some loved ones were experiencing, they took on very specific active roles to help deal with remand, which allowed them to manage this ambiguity related to their loved ones' incarceration, and reduce their own stress levels. So many spoke about chasing kind of criminal justice professionals, so whether that's solicitors, barristers, probation officers, being this middle person within these different systems, so providing lots of paperwork to lawyers, making sure nothing could be missed, staying on top of finances, on top of existing commitments that they had. So Sabina talks about that her daughter Grace was, Mum, can you do this for? Can you do this? And can you get that? And so she's talking about being this in between. You know, she was saying that her solicitor isn't doing her job properly. She hasn't met with her daughter, or she's only met them once in a year. And we argue that although potentially providing those on the outside with the role and helping to reduce this ambiguity, this support was incredibly time consuming, and taking on this active role potentially made the experience more stressful, more painful, and more frustrating. And remaining in contact, for example, undertaking very lengthy and expensive journeys to do the prison visits was another way that individuals were able to reduce feelings and experiences associated with ambiguous loss. However, contact, because often there are issues in relation to contact, and prison visits aren't necessarily the most positive experiences, often this attempt to kind of control this ambiguity was kind of counteracted by difficult visiting conditions. So it may exacerbate the harms of ambiguous loss when they have issues in relation to this. And importantly, everyone that we spoke to in our research was visiting or staying in contact with their loved ones. Lots of people in prison, those on remand and those who are sentenced, don't have contact with people on the outside. And we argue potentially this is a way for loved ones to gain control by not visiting those in prison and not kind of going through the day-to-day pain that is related to remand. So they are protecting themselves and regaining control. Other participants of the another one said about kind of taking control actually is actually kind of letting go, trying not to kind of take control. So for example, Sally speaks about one of the most important things is about acceptance. None of that is relevant anymore. So you're not coming out anytime soon. So we have to just get through each day and make things kind of less stressful. So trying to kind of give up that control. And then the last quote is that several spoke about prisoners trying to reduce the ambiguity to themselves and to their loved ones. So they often would submit a guilty plea, whether they considered themselves to be guilty or not. But this was in a hope to get a reduced sentence, but importantly, to get an end date of when they could work towards something. So, for example, Angela spoke, who's a partner of someone in prison, saying once we've kind of got this sentence, it's like Christmas. So you're kind of counting down towards the time when someone can come out. So we know what we are dealing with. And so we argue that defendants shouldn't feel pressure to enter guilty pleas to speed up the slow clogs of our criminal justice system and reduce the amount of time that they and those that are supporting them on the outside experience this ambiguity. And often this guilty plea didn't reduce this ambiguity because it kind of has a knock-on effect of when they are sentenced. I don't know where I'm doing time-wise, but I will conclude for you. So the motivation for our article and applying the theory of ambiguous loss to loved ones supporting remand prisoners was essentially to shed a light on the experiences of these people that we don't hear the voices of very often. And there is this very painful form of separation involved in it that we don't often think about when we talk about incarceration. So our paper discusses how the consequences of remand and the associated ambiguous loss are multifaceted, with loved ones experiencing potentially both types of ambiguous loss, and that this type of permanent imprisonment, which is often used very liberally by the criminal justice system in England and Wales, has serious consequences or repercussions to many, more than we would kind of think of. Two last points. So the current practices and policies ignore the impact of remand of loved ones, resulting in situations which are uncertain, very harmful to people's mental health, and they have so little control over what is happening. The numbers entering prison on remand are incredibly high, and they are increasing. And so the harms associated with these forms of separation will only increase. They're incredibly far-reaching if changes are not implemented. So the last thing I want to say is those making decisions about remand and bail must further consider all of the harms associated with them, including the impact on the loved ones who are often forgotten in these conversations. Thank you very much.
It's 13 minutes, so you bought Lucy your extra 2 minutes. To you, Lucy.
Use it wisely. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm presenting. This was my PhD research, so it's looking at how live music events in England and Wales are regulated and policed. And when I sort of say that topic, I'm wondering like what sort of aspects of regulation maybe you're bringing to mind, because in my experience, a lot of people I spoke to about this would kind of immediately bring up things like bouncers and door security, which is obviously a significant part of this regulation, but it's only one small part, because this is the table I attempted to make to map all the different areas of regulatory life that could apply to a single live music event. And after I finished it, I think I realised there's a couple of others I wish I'd added. So it's a dense and complicated regulatory landscape. So I'm going to show you like a tiny part today. And this work was based on interviews primarily, but also a bit of observation and some documentary analysis work. So because of our sort of short time, I'm going to skip ahead and I'm going to tell you what I concluded before I begin. So essentially, I found that the productive power of regulation, so this is this idea that regulation isn't just something that kind of closes off practice, but it's a way of it sort of creates new ways of organising our kind of social world, if you will. So this productive power of regulation actually contributed to the development of a live music industry that was formed in the image of neoliberalism. And there were 3 patterns that I found that led me to suggest that. And that's that live music's regulation made it very easy for large-scale actors to dominate in this industry. It set up situations where profits were prioritised while sort of safety and welfare of workers and performers and people attending events was undermined. And I saw the kind of racial and class hierarchies that predominate in neoliberalism like reproduced through this regulation. I'm going to focus on this middle bubble primarily, and I'm going to talk a bit about the parts of live music regulation that concern themselves with safety. So that includes health and safety, but it also includes licensing and door security, because that's one of the licensing objectives. Most live music venues or events will be licensed to sell alcohol and to host live performance in some combination. So if I start with the health and safety side of things, the people I spoke with, so I spoke a lot with people who worked in venues or who were venue managers or the similar roles for festival sites and outdoor events. And really, they told me they hardly ever saw health and safety inspectors. There was this one venue manager, never thinks they were visited one in the whole time they were running their venue, which led to their admission that their health and safety policy amounted to taping things up, which was slightly concerning. But what this essentially meant was, in the absence of more kind of consistent inspection and enforcement, teams started to develop their own understanding of what working safely meant. And somewhat, maybe unsurprisingly, working safely came to kind of be very responsive to commercial concerns. So some people spoke to me about how working safely sort of coincided with minimising liability. So there was a few instances of people talking about getting sign-off for things they've done. So this was kind of like the idea that if I've done done this part of a stage build, I'm gonna communicate this to whoever I'm handing it over to, and then it's kind of in their court, like I've got an email chain and somebody said this is okay. So this production manager was talking about conversations with a venue asking about how much weight the roof could hold for a lighting rig. So they were getting someone to kind of sign that off in an email and say, yes, you can hang this big heavy rig. And so instances like that probably does coincide with actual safe practice. That probably does ensure that things are being done well. But there are other times that this kind of minimising liability maybe was in place of a sort of concrete improvement in safety. So this musician at the top was talking about stage diving, and there was a particular venue where they'd been before and they'd stage dived, and this venue didn't want them to do it anymore. So instead of kind of, I don't know what they might have done, instead of kind of saying to this person, you can't stage dive, or we're going to put additional security around the pit so that when you do, you know, there's like people there, they gave them a contract and said, sign that, and if anything happens to anyone, it's your problem, not ours. So this was their first kind of understanding of working safely. The other side of it was that because they weren't really getting inspected a lot, the parts of like safety practice that might threaten their revenues were kind of ignored. So on the one hand, if you're getting sued, potentially you're going to lose a lot of the big profits you might expect from your event. So they were very responsive to those parts. But the sort of things that were like would have made things safer but would cost more money or more time or more staff, they weren't going to get picked up, because you need an inspector there to actually see it happen, and if there's no accident, no one will ever know. So there was a lot of discussion of very intense working schedules with people I spoke to. So this production manager was just like the prime example of it in this quote, I thought. So they're talking about builds on a tour, so building like the stage and all the set and everything. So they've said working hours, as in the sort of required legal limit on working hours in a week, we don't get near it. The only way I can execute what we do is that I will load in on a big show 10 trucks at 5 a.m. I'll work solid all day, I won't get to sleep, get out at 2 a.m. if we're lucky. I then get back up at 5 and do the same again, 3 days in a row. I'm lucky if I've had 6 hours sleep in 3 days. And this was not, this was not sort of uncommon, this kind of working pattern. And people talked about it on arena tours, in festivals. So it was a really strong pattern within the industry. The other part of live music regulation that's worried about safety, as I mentioned, is kind of licensing and event security. So where this part of live music had kind of conceived of working safely in this way that aligned with minimizing liability, there was a different understanding of safety when it came to kind of licensing. So here, discussions around safety of an event were almost all concerned with crowd management, but specifically with violence prevention. I wasn't so sure from the conversations I had with people who run venues or who worked in them that violence was a particularly prominent problem. Like, there weren't a lot of instances of people describing like very extreme violence to me, but when they came to sort of describe their safety considerations, it came up a lot more often. And the kind of longer those conversations went on, some of these concerns were fairly general, but some of them were really associated with specific audiences. And often it was audiences kind of defined by class and race, and those became the focus of safety concerns. So in some instances, it could be sort of a direct reference to a certain group, but more often it was kind of alluded to when talking about musical genre. So this second quote, for example, a grime night, you might be thinking more about weapons, is something a venue manager said to me about their sort of security planning before a gig. And I don't know if people are familiar with the genre of grime, but it's originated sort of primarily through young black men, and those are the kind of artists still predominantly associated with the genre. And that's so these kind of associations are they're sort of talking about the genre, but there's this link back to class and race there as well. And as you'll see, the second quote at the bottom, a promoter kind of reflected the same thing, that they've said when they bring shows, they're always expected that they're going to bring trouble because they've been pigeonholed as a grime promoter. The top quote as well shows how the regulation of live music comes into play to kind of establish those patterns, because the Licensing Act is in part kind of enforced by the police. So the police are what are known as a responsible authority. So if you have a license, the police, amongst many other bodies, get to kind of comment on that license and say whether or not you're going to be awarded it. And also if anything goes wrong, they can say whether they're going to take it away. And the police, I found, were fairly heavily involved, especially compared to the limited inspection when it came to health and safety, with sort of minute discussions with venues of like what events they had coming up and what kind of procedures they had in place and things like this. So some of this kind of labelling of certain shows as high risk was sort of being influenced by the police and the local authority. And I think that quote's quite a nice example of it. So that's everything I was going to share today. I'll leave you with the playlist I made that summarise the chapters of my thesis if anyone's interested. Maybe it communicates something that is better than my talk. But yeah, happy to take any questions. Thank you so much.
That's 12 minutes, so you're going to relax into it.
I will take you to somewhere very different now. It's a very old problem. I will try to propose some new solutions to this old problem, which is about gender inequality in paid employment in non-agricultural sectors in Middle East, North Africa, and also South Asia. Perhaps you already know about Claudia Golden. She's the first feminist economist who received Nobel Prize this year, and her arguments are widely circulated. And on the one hand, she contributes to mainstream understanding, but on the other hand, she also represents those ideas a little bit. So according to her, economic development initiates a shift from family farm and unpaid work towards factories and paid work. And this shift, in turn, plays an important role in decreasing the significance of gender in labor market. The only remaining problem for her today, which is a barrier to full gender convergence, is the gender pay gap linked to the time-bound inequality between men and women, actually. And she, drawing on this analysis, she proposes that child care costs should be reduced, and at the same time, flexibility of jobs, productivity of flexible jobs needs to be increased. This analysis is to a certain extent correct for almost all of the global north countries, but also correct for some parts of the global south, but not all parts of the global south. So her analysis of gender convergence in labor market heavily neglects the persistent gender gaps in the shift from agriculture to non-agricultural shift of labor from agriculture to non-agricultural jobs. When we look at the regions in the global south, I tried to calculate the gender gap in the labor shift from agriculture to non-agricultural employment. And I see significant gender gaps in South Asia and Middle East and North Africa. So men are migrating from unpaid agricultural jobs to paid non-agricultural jobs, but women are not migrating. But other regions in the global south, like Latin America and Caribbean and some of the poor countries in East Asia and Pacific, men and women are migrating together. And even sometimes women migrate first. Women leave agriculture and unpaid work and then go to non-agricultural jobs. So this persistent gender gap, which is significantly ignored by mainstream understandings, is actually affecting more than billions of women's life in working age population and their daughters as well. This represents the global south, and dark blue areas are the areas which are marked by gender gap in the shift from agriculture to non-agricultural employment. And they are historically marked. It is not just for the last 10 years, 20 years. I mean, if you go back to data like 1940s, they are historically marked with a massive gender gap. So my research is all about what is happening in those dark blue areas of the global south and why women are missing in paid employment. When we look at the current explanations, I categorize them under three groups, like demand side, supply side, culture and religion-based arguments. Demand side arguments mostly focus on level of economic growth. For them, capitalism either is not developed enough or there is something wrong about the development of capitalism. They really spend lots of effort on that. And they focus on oil gas revenues, role of oil gas revenues, and all the role system, how role system treats the dark blue areas. To a certain extent, I agree with some of their arguments, especially war violence related to oil gas revenues, and but not level of growth. Because I believe that these arguments are really capitalist development deterministic. They assume that women's labor is like men's, they are free, they just need to be pulled out of where they are. But what if under some conditions women's labor is not free? If women are working on the land as unpaid family workers and they are already having some job that they can't leave that job. Supply side arguments focus on mostly women's unpaid work at home, which is not market-led driven work. Unpaid work, domestic work, care work. But in my opinion, these arguments assume that majority of unpaid work women do are located at home. So women produce non-market goods and services at home. So they forget that there is also market-led production still draws on women's unpaid labor, which is agriculture, driven by the market forces, but draws on women's unpaid labor. Culture and religion-based arguments, I find them relatively essentialist. It's a long discussion, but especially Islam and Hinduism, they say very patriarchal. Previously, they used to say Catholicism as well. But they take these religious and cultural context as static, that nothing changes. That's why I find it essentialist. What I do in my research, I try to understand, because there is a gender gap from the shift from agriculture to non-agriculture. I try to understand what is different in agriculture and what prevents those women to migrate like men. And I can talk about methodology a little bit. It's heavily quantitative methodology, cross-country panel data analysis, and we focus on the case of India and use differences model. We compare states, and I like to share a little bit of key findings. The research is conducted by myself and another scholar in the United States, and you will be the first audience watching this video. Research is also funded by the unit of UK government, which used to be known as DFID before. What we found is actually, as agricultural land is a particular form of property, it's a means of production. When women are legally discriminated against in inheritance of agricultural land, they totally lose their control over that means of production. And when men establish the dominance over those special forms of means of production, they manage the production, entire production process, as well as women's labor on the land. And this has a huge impact on women's access to education, establishes a different form, different pattern of migration, different to, for example, what we see in Latin America. And women migrate to cities only if they get married to a single breadwinner. And this has a huge impact on their labor force participation as well. Today,
You want to share that video again?
okay, sorry. Anyway, I will try to talk about World Bank. Today, agricultural policies are driven by World Bank. World Bank dominates, my colleagues might disagree with me, but World Bank really dominates the discourse on international agricultural policy, and sustainable development goals, I believe, follow World Bank's policy in terms of gender equality in agriculture. What happens is, World Bank really wants women to access more rights in agriculture, like they intervene in discrimination and land inheritance in order to empower women. And some countries, including Turkey, they change their regulations. India has changed much before than Turkey. But what's happening is these regulations kind of locking women still in agriculture. Although access to land ownership is important for women, it is very important to acknowledge women's rights out of agriculture as well. Right to access education, right to access paid employment. And when we look at alternative policy frameworks, China is kind of promoting alternative policy frameworks, especially in Africa. They try to take women out of agriculture by providing full package like guaranteed employment, transportation, public transportation, accommodation, and then they support women to leave agriculture. Of course, there are negative points about that package as well, but I think it's crucially important to acknowledge women's rights out of agriculture for gender equality in general, for really empowering women and giving them a choice to stay or leave. And at the same time, it is important for sustainable development. Thank you.